Hey, it's Steven from Kurvy Woodworking, and in this video, I'll show you the steps I took to combine my carving, epoxy, and a live edge slab to make a custom sign for our shop. So if you watched our previous YouTube video, you'll recognize that this is the same log that we used to make the resin bench build. First step we're going to do is we're going to debark the live edge slab. So for that, we're going to be using a draw knife, and the reason for this is to remove the excess material on the exterior. That isn't bonded to the wood, so that's going to create a weak point that will eventually fall off over the years. So this piece was found in the back of a barn, so it had a lot of gunk, a lot of mold on it. It hasn't been touched for over 5 years. So we take a belt sander with a 60 grit sandpaper and we just clean up the edges and try to smooth out any gouges or warps that it may have accumulated over the time. On the live edge portions where we use the draw knife to get the bark off, we're going to have some gouges that I put in there by accident. So I'm just going to take 100 grit sandpaper on the rotary sander and I'm just going to smooth over those gouges to be a workable surface while keeping the natural live edge profile. So you see a lot of people doing some freehanding work with a router online to cut their designs. The problem is when you're dealing with a high RPM and with different densities in the wood, you're going to find yourself catching and grabbing differently on different portions of the wood. So what we do to make sure we have a perfect cut when we get to the final piece is I'm going to use a 1/4 inch piece of plywood, and that's going to be the template that I'm going to use. So I just print off some letters and I shape around the outside, I color around them, and I'm going to use a jigsaw to cut them out individually by letter. It's important to use plywood because it's very forgiving material, so you can be very accurate with your cuts while you're going through there, and you can take your time and grind it away. So once we're done with that, we're just going to clamp on that piece, and I'm going to be using a top guided router system. So what this is a cutting edge on the bottom of the router with a ball bearing on top. And that ball bearing is actually going to be pushing up against the template that I created. This is going to give me a perfect cut throughout the entire piece. When you're dealing with a live edge piece of wood that's been in the barn over 5 years, you're going to find yourself having a lot of warping. So no matter how much I sand this, I'm constantly getting flexes and deflections in this piece of wood. So to minimize the amount of epoxy that I lose, I'm going to put a piece of acrylic around the exterior of the letters. And that's going to allow me to keep the epoxy isolated. If I do have a leak, I'll be able to find it right away. So for the color, I decided to go with a copper mix. Now this is a metallic tint, so you're going to see a lot of texture in there and it's going to have a reflective look within it. And I think that's going to accent the maple really nicely. So I started off by mixing the epoxy, it's a 2-to-1 mix, and then add the tint afterwards. So on this piece, I was pretty certain that I wanted a solid color. However, on other pieces, you want to gradually increase the amount of tint that you use. It's hard to gauge based on the thickness of your pour how thick the color will actually be. So it's important to take it very slowly so you can be sure. So I'm going to show you the first pour that I completed, but I did take this in steps. Because this was older wood, I had different densities in the wood that I couldn't find beforehand. So I had some portions that held up very well, that were very hard. I had other portions that had some wormholes in it, which did add some nice texture, but also some sections that were a little more rotted. The wood wasn't as dense as it once was. So after this pour, I took another 2 or 3 passes and I kept on topping up the leathers, as some epoxy did seep within the wood. So the epoxy took around 3 days to set. So once that was complete, I took off the acrylic and I began the layouts. So you can see I did a semicircle design and I actually combined the two pieces together. That's going to kind of reflect off of the natural curvature of the wood. So when grinding it, you can grind with a cut-salt carbide bit, which is what I use for all my woodworking projects. And it does go through epoxy roughly the same that would go through wood. You're going to find it is a little bit of a tougher material, so you have to be a little more patient when you do go over those epoxy sections. Intermittently while I'm carving, I'm going to get a straight edge piece and I'm going to put it along the top of the carving. So that'll allow me to gauge the depth of how far I'm going with the grinder cut-salt bit. So while I am doing this, I have to keep in mind that the epoxy I set was only 1 inch deep. So for this carving, I set a maximum depth of my carvings to be 3/4 inch to make sure I don't go through that epoxy and have a gap in the leathers of the sign. I'm going to do this carving in multiple steps. So the first pass that I drew with the cut saw bit is going to be to bulk off the material. I'm going to go as fast as I can and as hard as I can, and that's just to remove as much material as I can within the lines I set. Once I'm complete that, I'm going to start to go lighter and lighter pressure, and I'm going to just start to skim over the material, and that's going to allow me to get a cleaner surface to minimize the amount of work I have to do afterwards with sanding and smoothing over these edges. You can start to get an idea of how much material I'm actually starting to remove. So this is the reason I typically like to do these carvings outside, where the wind will help to pick it up and there's not as much cleanup afterwards. However, lucky for me, it was raining on that day, so everything was done inside, and I made a mess that took me probably longer to clean up than the carving itself took. Now, the most tedious part of any of my carving projects isn't the grinding itself. While that's physically exerting and I'm usually drenched in sweat by the end of it, it's the sanding that takes the most amount of time. So to get rid of the gouges left by the cut saw grinder, the carbide bit, I'm going to start off by using a palm sander. So I'm going to combine using a palm sander and using a hand sander with a foam backing. That'll give me a uniform look throughout the entire thing. In between, I'm also going to take passes through with my hand, and that will allow me to feel any deviations in the curvatures that I added into this piece. So before we seal the front, we have to make sure that we seal the back with the same product. So I'm using an Osmo oil penetrating wax, and by sealing the back, I'm stopping any air or moisture from penetrating over the years. When we do the front, you can see that the Osmo oil wax allows the epoxy along with the wood grain to really pop. So you can start to see the black, the pink lines, and you can also see the epoxy color come through. So this is the final product, and this is how it's going to look. We're going to put a couple of coats of the Osmo oil wax, and the thicker of coats that we put, the more shine you're going to get through the piece. And the more shine you have, the more you can see the grains, the more you can see the colors, and the more you can see the texture of the carving that I put in there. Alright guys, this was a quick side project that we put in the shop. We just figured that we needed to have a sign to be semi-legitimate, maybe even quarter-legitimate. But either way, this is the final product and is now hanging proudly up in our shop. If you'd like to see more projects of this sort, along with our liquor cabinet design, our jukebox design that's currently coming up, please be sure to click that subscribe button and also hit that alert button. We're going to start to throw some more smaller projects in the mix over here. As well, if you would like to see progress updates of what we are currently working on in the shop, be sure to follow our Instagram at Kurvy Woodworking, and you'll be seeing work that we accomplish the day that we accomplish them. So until next time, thank you for watching.